Hello, my name is Carrie Smoke, and today we're going to talk about the Mars Hills approach, which I'll explain as we go on. I am a apologetics lecturer and I have a Master of Science degree in public health. For more information about my background, I have recorded a short video called My Story. We will be looking at 6 lessons in this series. As we talked about today, we'll talk about the Mars Hill approach, and you can see on the screen the various topics that we'll be covering in the coming weeks. So the purpose of this presentation will be explained, then I'll give an overview of the theory of evolution, talk about inference to the best explanation, and talk about the approach, the Mars Hill approach, used in this presentation. So the purpose, it is to help Christians to understand and evaluate the evidence that scientists use to support the theory of evolution. The purpose is not to argue with the scientific evidence. For example, not to argue whether or not the earth is young or old, but to understand and evaluate the scientific evidence. Here's a quote from John Collins, quote, "And further, it is not illegal in American public schools to present evidence for and against neo-Darwinists so long as the presenter confines himself to the evidence." And so this is exactly what I want to do. I want to demonstrate how to deal with scientific evidence without referring to the Bible. I believe that this approach is biblical, as I explain as we go along in today's talk. First of all, let's look at Psalm 19 verses 1 through 2 in the English Standard Version. It says, quote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." This psalm shows that nature speaks. We call this general revelation. Therefore, we will let the evidence from nature speak for itself. We also find in Psalm 111, verse 2, it says, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." The word studied literally means to inquire, to search with care. Thus, God delights when we study his works, which include nature. Science is the study of the natural world, and polls show that the number one reason that people do not believe in God, that God exists, is that science has disproven that God exists. Time magazine in 1966 had this cover, "Is God Dead?" And that has been the attitude of many people since 1966 and probably before that. Biblical examples of dealing with secular evidence or scientific evidence. I call this the Mars Hills approach, and is found in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, shows us how to use an unbeliever's own evidence. In verse 22 of that chapter, Paul perceived that the men of Athens were very religious. In verse 23, Paul used their idol to an unknown God to begin his talk about the one true God. And then in verse 28b, Paul quotes one of their own poets. So he's showing us how to use evidence from their own culture before getting into an explanation of what he believes about the Bible and about Jesus and about salvation and things like that. So the idea is that using the believer's own evidence is a good way to start a conversation about God. Evolution. So what I will do in this series is demonstrate how to look at scientists' own evidence to see whether or not the evidence supports evolution. And again, I do have a Master of Science degree and a Bachelor of Science degree and worked as a scientist, as you'll find out in the short video called My Story. So let's look at an overview of the theory of evolution. The big picture is that there's cosmological evolution, that the universe came into existence by chance. Biologic evolution, amoeba to man, and under that would be human evolution, the idea that apes and mankind had a common ancestor perhaps 2 million years ago. And then chemical evolution, the idea that random mutations produce new species, and this is called transmutation. So On the Origin of Species was published by Charles Darwin in 1859. His idea was that universal common descent equaled the idea that every organism on Earth arose from a single common ancestor by a process called descent with modification. The theory of evolution, the theory of common descent, is represented by his branching tree of life. I know this is very hard to see, but I hope some of you have seen this tree before, and that the idea at the bottom is like amoeba, and as you go up, everything has evolved up until you get into more and more complex life forms. Darwin's idea of natural selection is the process that he said could generate change by this branching tree of life. Darwin argues that natural selection, acting on random variations or mutations, could alter the features of organisms and produce new organisms. So just like humans can intelligently alter features of animals through selective breeding, for example, humans can alter the stock of dogs, horses, sheep, and so on through selective breedings. So that's the idea there when Darwin says natural selection could produce mutations and produce new organisms. But what we see when we do selective breeding, even though we get different types of dogs, they're still dogs. They're not something new. Same thing with horses and sheep and other types of selective breeding. It still remains in the state that it was. A dog is a dog. So we need to look at the idea here of adaptation versus transmutation of species. Adaptation, the idea, Darwin showed that evolution, random mutation, and natural selection could explain the adaptation by species. In other words, adapting to different environments. Darwin in On the Origin of Species showed two examples of adaptations: the beaks of finches in the Galapagos Islands and the color change light to dark of peppered moths from the smog in Manchester, England. So here we see 4 different beaks of finches that Darwin found on the Galapagos Island. And these are adaptations to their environment so that their beak is able to get the food that they need on the Galapagos Islands. So what we see here is that these are still all finches, and if you were to crossbreed them, they would still breed. In other words, they are not a new species. They are still of the species of the finch, even though they have different looking beaks. So let's continue a little bit further. Darwin further argued that evolution could show how complex life forms develop from a single organism, transmutation of species, in other words, the Darwinian tree of life. So in other presentations, I look at the evidence for adaptation and transmutation of species and let the evidence speak for itself. For example, in a presentation on chemical evolution or transmutation, I will look at whether or not genetic mutations support this idea of transmutation of species. Let's look at this idea of what we call inference to the best explanation. There's a new book, relatively, published in 2021 by Stephen Meyer called The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen Meyer explains a concept called inference to the best explanation. So let's look at this. Suppose you are walking in a forest and in a clearing you see a cabin. Your initial impression is that the cabin is abandoned. You go into the cabin and open the front door. You see a hot cup of tea brewing on the table and see dishes in a sink. Then you hear water running, probably in the bathroom. What is your conclusion now? Someone is living in the cabin. Inference to the best explanation means that you make conclusions based on the available evidence. In the example of the cabin, your first impression was wrong. It wasn't correct. Based on further evidence, you drew a different conclusion. So here's what we will be looking at in this series. We'll be looking at things like the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, fitness of the environment for life on Earth, the fossil record, and DNA. We'll ask the question, which is a better explanation of these things that we will look at? Is it theism, the belief in God, or is it evolution? And we'll use inference to the best explanation to make that decision. So again, the approach that I'm using in this presentation, in this whole series, is that we will look at how the evidence that evolutionists use in supporting the theory of evolution. In other words, that will be the goal. We'll actually look at scientific evidence and make a decision for ourselves. Does theism or evolution best explain scientific evidence? Inference to the best explanation is the key component of how we will consider the evidence used by evolutionists in making decisions. For example, we can point to design in nature and ask, which is a better explanation of the design that we see in nature? Is it random chance or an intelligent designer? We will also look at this Mars Hill approach and use the idea that the Apostle Paul used in quoting Greek poets, their idols, and culture to point them to God. This is a good approach because you are relating first to people in their culture and using things that they are familiar with. Thus, I believe this is a biblical approach to use secular evidence, in this case scientific evidence, and point people to God. Instead of arguing over the evidence, the goal is to show how an alternate way of looking at evidence using inference to the best explanation. This is an important point. We don't want to get into arguments in things like, is the earth old or young, but actually look at alternative ways of looking at the actual evidence. And when we look here again further, this idea that Apostle Paul using their own evidence, once we have opened their spiritual eyes to the truth, general revelation, then we can use the Bible, special revelation, to lead people to faith in Christ. General revelation is the idea that in nature, God has revealed himself to all people. Special revelation is the idea that the Bible is what then further takes people to faith in Christ, not general revelation. So that's my presentation for today. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I welcome any comments and feedback. Thank you. Bye.